Hi everyone, welcome to the War Connoisseur. Hope you enjoy today's video and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. My War Memories, 1914-1918. My thoughts and actions. The coup de main at Liège was the first of the series of German victories. The decision was a bold one and its execution extremely daring. The campaigns of 1914, 1915 and the summer of 1916 in the East were tremendous achievements, equal to the greatest military feats of any age. They made the highest demands on both commanders and troops. The Russians were then greatly superior in numbers to the Allied German and Austro-Hungarian armies opposed to them. But indeed, the operations which Field Marshal von Hindenburg and I had to conduct from the 29th August 1916, the day we assumed supreme command, rank among the most formidable in history. Nothing more awe-inspiring and destructive has ever been seen on earth. Germany, inferior in numbers and with weak allies, was contending against the world. Decisions of the utmost gravity had to be taken. They were the inevitable and logical result of the situation, our general conception of war, and the particular circumstances of this war. The armies and fleets fought as they had fought in days past, even though numbers and equipment were mightier than ever before. What made this war different from all others was the manner in which the home populations supported and reinforced their armed forces with all the resources at their disposal. Only in France, in 1870-71, had anything of the kind been seen before. In this war it was impossible to distinguish where the sphere of the army and navy began and that of the people ended. Army and people were one. The world witnessed the War of Nations in the most literal sense of the word. In this mighty concentration of effort, the great powers of the earth faced each other. And not only between the armed forces did the combat rage along those huge fronts and on distant oceans. The moral and vital force of the civil population was assailed with the purpose of corroding and paralyzing them. With big battalions it is neither difficult nor very risky to wage war and fight battles. But in the first 3 years of the war, the Field Marshal and I never found ourselves in that enviable position. We could but act as duty and conscience dictated, and adopt the measures we deemed necessary to secure victory. During this period, success crowned our efforts. When, in March 1918, we attacked with the balance of numbers more in our favour than had previously been the case, our strength sufficed to win great victories, but not to bring about a rapid decision. Then it dwindled, while the enemy grew stronger. This worldwide war of nations made enormous demands on us Germans, on whom its whole overwhelming burden fell. Every individual had to give his very utmost if we were to win. We had literally to fight and work to the last drop of blood and sweat, and yet maintain our fighting spirit and, above all, our confidence in victory. A hard but imperative necessity, in spite of the dearth of food which the enemy imposed on us, and the onslaught of his propaganda, which was of amazing force, if unobtrusive. Our army and navy are rooted in the nation, as is the oak in German soil. They live upon the homeland, and from it they draw their strength. They can keep, but cannot produce, what they need, and can only fight with the moral, material, and physical means which the country provides. These means make possible victory, faithful devotion and unselfish self-sacrifice in the daily battle and the miseries of war. They alone could secure Germany's final success. With them our country waged the titanic conflict against the world, even allowing for the assistance of our allies and the exploitation of occupied territories as far as the laws of land warfare permitted. The army and navy had thus to look to the homeland for their constant renewal and rejuvenation in moral, numbers and equipment. It was essential to maintain the moral and war spirit of those at home at the highest pitch. Woe to us if they should fail. The longer the war lasted, the greater grew the danger of this, the harder it became to overcome difficulties, and the more imperious were the demands of the army and navy for spiritual and morale reinforcement. The very last resources, both in men and material, had to be made available and devoted to the prosecution of the war. These were enormous tasks for the country. The homeland was not only the basis on which our proud military power rested, and which must therefore be carefully safeguarded, it was the life-giving source which had to be kept clear, pure, and yet potent, lest it lose anything of that virtue wherewith it steeled the nerves and renewed the strength of the army and navy. The nation needed those inner spiritual forces which alone enabled it to go on revitalizing the army and navy. The spheres of the nation and of the armed forces were so intermingled that it was impossible to separate them. The fighting efficiency of the forces in face of the enemy depended absolutely upon that of the people at home. That meant that everyone at home must work and live for the war in a way that had never been known before. It was for the government and the Imperial Chancellor, who was specially responsible, to direct and foster that spirit. Upon this, Minister devolved another important war function, the direction of operations against the enemy's home fronts. Should Germany neglect to use this powerful weapon, the effects of which she daily experienced in her own body, should we not attack the morale of our enemies in the same way as they were, unfortunately so successfully, attacking ours? This contest had first to be transferred to neutral countries, and thence from front to front. But Germany always lacked one mighty means of propaganda: starvation of the enemy peoples by blockade. The government had great problems to solve if the war was to be brought to a successful conclusion. No greater demand has ever been made on a German government than to place the united strength of the German people at the disposal of the Emperor in order to secure victory in the field and carry on the war against the spirit and moral of the enemy nations. Thus the action and conduct of the government attained decisive importance. This meant that government, Reichstag and people must devote themselves utterly to the idea of war. That was the only way. The power to wage war had its source at home and was put to the proof at the front. The great aim of peace could only be attained by relentless prosecution of the war. By working for the war, therefore, the government at the same time paved the way for peace, to attain which at the first possible moment was their glorious ultimate goal. Soon after we were summoned to assume the supreme command and had time to consider the situation in all its bearings, the Field Marshal and I laid our views as to the requirements of the Army and Navy before the Imperial Chancellor, and discussed the problems which they raised for the country. We called upon him to cooperate in prosecuting the war, and were buoyed up with hope in spite of the menacing aspect of the situation. The government had welcomed our appointment to the Supreme Command. We met them with frank confidence. Soon, however, two schools of thought, represented by their views and ours, began to come into conflict. This divergence of view was a great disappointment to us, and vastly increased our burden. In Berlin, they were unable to accept our opinion as to the necessity of certain war measures, or to steel their wills to the point of magnetizing the whole nation and directing its life and thought to the single idea of war and victory. The great democracies of the Entente did better. With an iron will, Gambetta in 1870-71 and Clemenceau and Lloyd George in this war enrolled their peoples in the Seine ice of victory. Our government failed to recognize this inflexible purpose and the definite intention of the Entente to destroy us. They should never have doubted it. Instead of concentrating all our resources and using them to the utmost in order to achieve peace on the battlefield, as the very nature of war demands, the authorities in Berlin followed a different path. They talked more and more about reconciliation and understanding, without giving our own people a strong warlike impetus at the same time. In Berlin they believed, or deceived themselves into believing, that the hostile nations were longing to hear words of reconciliation and would urge their governments towards peace. So little did they understand the mind of our enemies, both people and governments, their strong national feeling and unbending will. Berlin had learned nothing from history. They only felt their own impotence in face of the enemy's spirit. They lost the hope of victory and drifted. The desire for peace became stronger than the will to fight for victory. The road to peace was blocked by the will of the enemy, whose aim was our destruction. In seeking it, the government neglected to lead the nation by the hard road to victory. Reichstag and people found themselves without that strong lead, which, generally speaking, they longed for, and slid with the government down the slippery way. The tremendous questions arising out of the war were more and more thrust on one side, for people's minds were occupied with questions of internal politics and thoughts of self. That meant the ruin of our country. It may be that the revolution which is now shattering Europe may usher in a new world order, and make the thoughts and feelings of the nations more ready for a peace of justice and reconciliation. The armistice and peace conditions certainly point the other way. In any case, all the time I was First Quartermaster General, the world had not yet changed. Our General Staff took the same view as President Wilson, who supported his demand for a great American naval program on the grounds that it would be absurd for America to adjust her naval program to a future world policy when the latter had not yet been decided. In November 1918, the President of the Soldiers' Council of the Fourth Army wrote, "Some people may think that the revolution can be built up on ideals. Those who are at the front must agree that the world policy of the Entente at the present time is infected by materialism." The astonished world, its ideals shattered, now perceives this clearly. The German people has been misled, and is now paying for its delusion with its life. The General Staff urged the view that it would be time enough for us to lay down our arms and think about understandings when human nature had undergone a change. Otherwise we were bound to suffer. The palm of peace is no defence against the sword. As long as human beings, and above all our enemies, remained the same as mankind has ever been, it was for Germany, and in any event, the Field Marshal and myself, as the responsible military leaders, to hold the sword tight and keep it sharp. It was, therefore, our serious duty, in dealing with the government, to insist on the necessary war measures being carried out, and to try and infuse into them that degree of determination which we thought was required. In all questions, the General Staff addressed itself to the constitutional authorities. The war required rapid and far-reaching decisions at any moment, and thus stimulated that quality of resolution on which it was always making demands. In Berlin, the old peace routine held sway. Replies, even to the most important questions, often did not arrive for weeks. In consequence of this extraordinary dilatoriness on the part of the Berlin authorities and their failure to grasp the necessities of the war, the tone of our correspondence at times became somewhat acrimonious. This we regretted, but we were consumed with justifiable impatience. Immediate action was called for it was often a question of averting some irreparable disaster. In peacetime, the imperial government was the supreme authority. The Foreign Office considered itself above all criticism. The government departments only gradually accustomed themselves to the idea that on the outbreak of war, a new authority, General Headquarters, had come into being, which not only shared the responsibility with the Imperial Chancellor, but bore such an enormous proportion that it had necessarily to try and make good their inertia, by displaying greater energy on its own part. I could have wished that the government had recognized this simple situation as clearly. The position of General von Moltke and General von Falkenhayn in relation to the government was essentially the same as that of the Field Marshal and myself. The government went their own way, and, as regards the wishes of General Headquarters, neglected nothing which they considered essential. But much was left undone that had been insisted on as urgently necessary for the prosecution of the war. Directly after war broke out, General Headquarters was obliged to take action in connection with several matters which were really the sphere of other authorities. The press, the censorship, precautions against spies and sabotage at home, dealing with revolutionaries, all these wide fields were left to the unaided efforts of the military authorities, to the detriment of the conduct of the war. Uncertainty as to their powers and lack of personnel checked the initiative of the authorities concerned. Its strong sense of responsibility urged the General Staff to creative work. It was better able to meet the requirements in personnel than other departments, particularly from among well-trained officers of the reserve on leave. and so the direct tie-in of this work fell into the hands of the General Staff. The execution often remained in those of the home authorities. The line of demarcation within which these authorities considered themselves to be solely responsible was not clearly defined. Friction was unavoidable. This would have been avoided by that resolute leadership at home for which General Headquarters often asked. As First Quartermaster General, it was often my duty, personally, to lay the demands of the General Staff before the government. Of political personages and parties I took no account. Those parties which were forever talking about understanding, instead of fostering the warlike spirit of the nation, did not recognize the need for the demands put forward. The government shared their views, and thus the government and the majority parties found themselves in agreement and adopted an antagonistic attitude towards me and my military views and wishes. It was obvious that I had more supporters among those parties which, like myself, regarded an understanding as impossible in view of the enemy's determination to destroy us, and therefore wished the war to be carried on with the greatest energy. I never asked for their support, but they trusted me. These parties belonged to the right, the minority. And so, although I thought only of the war, the rest labelled me reactionary. Had I found my own ideas accepted by the democratic parties, I should have found supporters among them also, in which case the right would perhaps have abused me as a Democrat, and, as a matter of fact, this happened often enough. I am neither a reactionary nor a Democrat. All I stand for is the prosperity, the cultural progress and national strength of the German people, authority and order. These are the pillars on which the future of our country rests. During the war we had only one aim, to develop the greatest energy in its prosecution, and so secure our military existence, and with it our equally important economic existence, both during and after the war. The inertia of the imperial government in so many matters had unpleasant consequences for me, in that ill-wishers, and sometimes even overzealous friends, dragged me into the strife of parties, although I was not at all concerned and never put myself forward in any way. What I did was misrepresented and criticised without reference to circumstances. My actions and statements were misinterpreted. Vague and totally unfounded assertions were spread broadcast. At first, my frank and soldierly way of thinking prompted me to dismiss all this with a shrug of the shoulders. It was not worth notice in view of the great work on which I was engaged. Later on, I regretted these occurrences, but was unable to do anything to prevent them. I repeatedly asked the press to leave me alone. Beyond that, I was too busy to take any action myself. Besides, I had no platform from which to speak, and above all, I gave the German nation credit for more sense of the stern reality. But it suited the government to have discovered a lightning conductor. Instead of protecting me, they gave free rein to the agitators, represented me as a dictator, put everything down to the General Staff, and so embittered the feeling against me. That was the position, broadly speaking. The two chancellors, Dr. Michaelis and Count von Hertling, were far above any such intrigues, but the irreparable mischief, and in view of my military position, it was nothing short of a national disaster, was already done. It became more and more the fashion to hold the General Staff, which in this case meant myself, responsible for our troubles and miseries. For example, my name was associated not only with the unavoidable hardships, but even with some of the abominations of the home rationing system. Indeed, I was represented as their author and blamed accordingly. Neither the Quartermaster General nor the Intendant General, nor I had anything to do with the food supply at home, which was entirely in the hands of the War Ministry and the Food Control Office. After my resignation, I heard from leaders of the Social Democratic Party that I had been responsible for the manner in which the GOCs of the core districts had administered the regulations dealing with the right of public meeting. This was entirely outside my province. The following case is typical. In the winter of 1916 to 17, I was blamed for the shortage of transport and coal. This was mainly due to insufficient provision having been made before I was appointed to General Headquarters. In February 1917, I urged the appointment of a coal controller. Unfortunately, the right man was not discovered at once, and another had to be selected later on. In the summer of 1917, 50,000 miners were released by General Headquarters from service at the front. In the winter of 1917–18, house fuel was more plentiful than in the previous one, but General Headquarters, which had taken decisive measures and was certainly more responsible for the improved situation than for the bad conditions of 1916–17, got neither thanks nor credit. That did not fit in with the ideas of those who were agitating against me, or of those others who, though better informed themselves, allowed the agitation to go on. The enormous responsibility I had to bear made me long for the conclusion of hostilities. How could it have been otherwise? I often expressed myself in that sense. But unless we got a peace which safeguarded the existence of our country, the war would be lost. I could not see how peace was possible unless the enemy also was ready for it. I thought it very dangerous for us to be alone in announcing a desire for peace. I was fully aware that nations do not get peace merely by talking about it, or even heartily longing for it. The pacifist idea of a peace by understanding was for many a weapon against us. Many others sincerely believed in it, being moved by that spirit of exalted idealism which has not yet been realized in this world of strife. But did these idealists know whether the enemy thought as they did, and if he did not, was it not clear that by spreading the notion that we could obtain such a peace at any time, they were leading the way to irreparable disaster because, since human nature is made that way, they were inevitably weakening our war spirit, which should at all costs have been strengthened. They made our people yearn for peace without making the enemy ready for it. In fact, they made peace more difficult of attainment, as the Entente knew all about the state of feeling in our country and used it for their own purposes. These idealists also impeded the efforts of the General Staff to make the enemy more inclined for peace by those means which alone lead to success in war. In spite of all their idealism, they are responsible for the misfortunes of our country. I know of no time when the attitude of the enemy justified our hope for a fair and just peace by understanding. Everything that has been said or written on this subject is wide of the mark. The government never indicated to General Headquarters a possible opening for such a peace. No doubt we could at any moment have had such a peace as has now been forced upon us. What chancellor, what statesman, what man with true German feeling in his blood would have even thought of it? But everyone might have known perfectly well that no other peace was to be had, and so there was nothing for it but to fight for victory once the war had started. Towards the end, Count Czernin evidently thought as I did, although he too would not admit the truth. In his speech of the 10th December 1918, he said, "The best we could hope for was to take advantage of a favour-able military situation, such as might still be expected, to propose a peace which, while involving considerable sacrifices, would perhaps have had a chance of being accepted by the enemy." But the more brilliant their successes, the more exacting did the German military leaders become, and after their great victories it was less possible than ever to persuade them to such a policy of renunciation. I believe that there actually was one, and only one moment in the course of this war when such an attempt really seemed very likely to succeed, and that was after the famous Battle of Gorlice. The Battle of Gorlice was fought in May 1915. Subsequently, therefore, according to Count Czernin, there was no chance of peace at all, even at the cost of considerable sacrifices. And even if there had been a chance, either in May 1915 or later, not only the German military party, but almost the whole German people would have refused it so long as they felt proudly confident of their strength. This confidence and strength should have been fostered by the statesmen in order to keep the will to victory alive in the country and preserve it from the immeasurable disaster of defeat. The determination of our enemies being what it was, there could be no middle course. Our will in the matter was of no account. That of the enemy was not yet broken. When this had been effected by military victory, the diplomats might talk about reconciliation, if they still wanted to. For 4 years, the Field Marshal and I worked together like one man, in the most perfect harmony. With the most profound satisfaction, I saw him become the German national hero of this war, the very personification of victory for every German. The Field Marshal permitted me to participate in his glory. At the celebration of his 70th birthday on the 2nd October 1917, he put that sentiment into particularly touching words. The Commander-in-Chief bears the final responsibility. He bears it before the world and, what is harder, before himself, his own army and his own country. As Chief of Staff and First Quartermaster General. I shared his responsibility to the fullest extent and have always been fully conscious of the fact. I am ready to answer for my actions at any time. Our strategical and tactical views were in complete agreement, and harmonious and confident cooperation was the natural result. After discussion with my assistants, I used to lay my ideas for the initiation and conduct of all operations briefly and concisely before the Field Marshal. I have the satisfaction of knowing that from Tannenberg to my resignation in October 1918, he always agreed with my views and approved my draft orders. Our conception of the character of this war of nations and the necessary measures it involved were also identical, and so were our views on the peace question. Like me, he strove to secure the life of the German people against fresh aggression. He put the whole weight of his personality behind these views. Those to whom the authority of the General Staff was, or might be, an obstacle to the attainment of their own selfish ends sought to drive a wedge between the Field Marshal and myself. They dared not attack him, so they thought it politic to strike at me. They invented differences between his views and actions and mine. According to them, he personified the good principle, I the evil one. Those who spread such notions should at least have made him jointly responsible for all the alleged mischief. Otherwise, they undermine his position and obviously present him as a man who could not possibly possess all the great qualities they ascribe to him, qualities he does most certainly possess. The reputation of the Field Marshal stands secure enough in the hearts of the German people. I have always held him in honour and served him faithfully, and I esteem his noble qualities of mind not less highly than his devotion to his king and his readiness to assume responsibility. Mine has been a life of work for our country, the Emperor and the army. During the 4 years of war, I lived only for the war. My days followed a regular plan. All the time I was Chief of the Staff in the East and had direct control of troops. Everything was determined by the requirements of the military, situation. I was in the office from 6 or 7 in the morning until late at night. When I was First Quartermaster General, I used to start work, when the front was inactive, about 8 o'clock. The Field Marshal arrived perhaps an hour later, and we would briefly discuss military events and plans and any pending questions. 12 noon we made our report to His Majesty the Emperor. At 1 sharp we went to luncheon, which lasted half or 3/4 of an hour. Before 3:30 I was again in the office. At 8 we had dinner, and after an interval of an hour and a half we resumed work until 12 or 1 at night. This regular existence was but seldom interrupted. Even during my 4 or 5 days' war leave I was not altogether free of duty. I was in telephonic and telegraphic communication with all parts of the front and with the general headquarters of our allies. The armies sent in regular morning and evening reports, but continuous reports were furnished when anything unusual occurred. The Chief of Field Telegraphs in the East, Colonel Lehmann, and later the Chief of Field Telegraphs for the whole army, Major General Hesse, rendered me comprehensive and effective assistance. The telephone formations belonging to the staff of the Commander-in-Chief in the East and the Field Telegraph Service of General Headquarters, which were responsible for the details of intercommunication, worked extraordinarily well. On the one hand, it was necessary to obtain a clear idea of all events that took place on any part of the enormously extended fronts, but on the other, it was uncommonly difficult to feel the pulse of the fighting immediately. but it was absolutely essential that General Headquarters should be informed of all important events at once, as only too often the shortage of reserves obliged us to make immediate decisions of the very greatest importance. The work of commanding the troops, looking after the welfare of the army and maintaining fighting efficiency at home took precedence of everything else. Questions of future military and political policy were regarded as secondary. The working hours were absorbed by my own work, reports by my subordinate directors and heads of departments and services, and discussions. I have the pleasantest memories of our work and social life together, both on my staff in the East and at General Headquarters. The enormous amount of work and the heavy responsibility which devolved upon me made it imperative for me to surround myself with independent, upright men, on whom I could call to express their opinions freely and frankly. They certainly did so, very emphatically too, on occasions. Our cooperation was based on mutual confidence, and my colleagues ever stood faithfully and firmly by me. They were my active and devoted assistants, imbued with the highest sense of duty. The final decision, of course, rested with me, for responsibility permitted of no hesitation. War demanded rapid action. But decision did not mean despotism. And when I did disagree with the proposals of my assistants, I never hurt their feelings. In such cases, and when divergent views had to be reconciled, I endeavoured, without being vague, to recognize the grounds for differences of opinion. The fame and great reputations of my associates have always been a matter of sincere satisfaction to me. I always was, and am still, of the opinion that this war was so tremendous and made such great demands that one man alone could not possibly cope with it. It gave plenty of opportunity for brilliant work. My chief assistant in the East was Lieutenant Colonel, now Major General, Hoffman, an intellectual and progressive officer. My opinion of him as a soldier is best shown by the fact that I suggested him as my successor when I was appointed to General Headquarters at the end of August 1916. In that position, he justified his selection as brilliantly as he had when acting as my senior staff officer. At General Headquarters, I chose Lieutenant Colonel Wetzel to supervise operations. I had met him previously and knew his value. He was familiar with the Western Front, where he had distinguished himself as senior staff officer and chief of staff of the 3rd Corps, and had done particularly well at Verdun. He has a splendid soldierly spirit and a strong and faithful character. With his enterprising and fertile mind and the care he put into his work, he proved an excellent and valued assistant. In September 1918, I found it necessary to redistribute the staff in order to allow myself a little more leisure. That's it for today, everyone. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Stay tuned.